Welcome to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates series. I'm your host, Paul Vogelzang, and this is episode number 191. As part of our Smithsonian Associates Art of Living series, our guest today on the Not Old Better Show is John Eaton. John Eaton is an acclaimed pianist, musicologist, and humorist. John Eaton has the honor of performing for Smithsonian audiences since 1978. John Eaton joins us today to share some of his insights and fascinating observations, and he will be performing for our Not Old Better audience, so stick around to the end. But his 4-part program covers so much music, composers, and history.
Hey, Paul, I'm sitting here realizing that I did my first program for the Smithsonian back in 1978. And here it is, 2018, 40 years later, and I have yet another series of programs coming up next month. I don't pretend to be modest or even immodest, but I think the key to my longevity is really the wonderful songs of George Gershwin, Hoagy Carmichael, Richard Rodgers, and all the other composers who contributed to what they now call the Great American Songbook. There's been a lot of water under the bridge since 1978, but the songs remain as solidly wonderful as the day they were written, and therein lie a lot of fascinating stories.
That, of course, is our guest today, John Eaton, who will be at the Smithsonian Associates program presenting a 4-part series starting April 18th and running to May 9th, titled John Eaton From Broadway to Hollywood. Oh, and something else. During John's performances, of course, John always takes requests. Please join me in welcoming to the Not Old Better Show via Skype, John Eaton. John Eaton, what a pleasure it is to talk with you. You've been performing dazzling audiences at the Smithsonian since 1978. Your current 4-session program, which is April 18th through May 9th, is titled From Broadway to Hollywood. What can we expect from you during your presentations?
Well, I'm going to cover, first of all, the bases I always cover in this course. First of all, I do a program on melody only, and I've chosen this year to do Hoagy Carmichael as an example of a great writer of melodies. And then the second program is going to be about Richard Rodgers, who, of course, was one of the greatest melodists who ever lived, but he also had this incredible relationship with his lyricists, Lorenz Hart and Oscar Hammerstein. And he wrote entirely different kinds of music for each lyricist. And so I discussed the relationship, obviously a fascinating relationship between the lyricist and the melodist. And then I decided I'd do a program on the 1940s, which was the era in which I grew up, became a teenager and a young adult. And it's a incredible era, really, because it was, as all eras are, it was the end of something and the beginning of something else. And the early 40s were really an extension of the 1930s in many ways. The big bands were still going. It was sort of business as usual. And then you had an entirely separate kind of song that was written, what we call World War II songs. And the greatest of these were written by Julie Stein and Sammy Cahn. And then after the war, you could sense change. And I used for that purpose the great recording that Nat King Cole did of Nature Boy, which was a song by an early hippie, Eaton&nbsp, and it transformed Nat Cole from a well-known jazz pianist and singer into a superstar. with a very, very broad audience, all of which were listening to a song by a hippie. So that was kind of anticipating what was to happen 20 years later in the 60s. At the same time, as I say, you had business as usual. You had Irving Berlin in 1945 and 6 writing his greatest score, Annie Get Your Gun. And bear in mind that he'd been really the first songwriter, the man who kind of created the American popular song back in 1910. And here he was in 1945, just really hitting his stride. And 1948, of course, was the year that Cole Porter wrote Kiss Me, Kate. And you had new writers like Frank Lesser, following in the tradition of the older songwriters. A very rich period, covers a lot of bases. And then finally, I'm going to do a program on the movie composers. But in fact, the movie composers were in large part the same writers who had been writing for Broadway previously. And in the 1930s, they all drifted out to Hollywood to make a living because the Broadway theater had pretty much dried up. And so you had Gershwin and Berlin and Jerome Kern writing for the movies and contributing a wonderful body of songs. And then the kind of movie writers themselves, people like Jimmy Van Heusen and Harry Warren particularly, who was a New Yorker, part of the old gang, but who became famous writing movie songs. So that's kind of a summary of what I'm going to do.
It sounds like a wonderful group of songwriters, of music, and a great period. You mentioned Hoagy Carmichael earlier. What can you tell us specifically about his music?
Well, Hoagy is simultaneously one of the most popular composers with the general public, whoever was, but he was also a musician's musician. His songs, even his most popular songs, Stardust, Georgia on My Mind, sound deceptively simple. I mean, they're very easygoing, but they're actually very challenging and difficult to learn. And this is what musicians found right from the very beginning. And there are two reasons for this, I think. First was whatever little demon was in Hoagy's head that made him do unconventional things and write in an unconventional way. And secondly, his background as a jazz pianist and essentially a jazz composer. I mean, Hoagy, in the beginning, in the 20s, considered himself a jazz composer. He didn't consider himself a songwriter, but he had such a genius for melody that that side of him couldn't be ignored, and so he morphed into a songwriter and one of the greatest that we've ever had. And he was from the Midwest, from Indiana, and that separated him from the New York scene, and I think that played into the way he wrote too. And then there was his bourbon and branchwater voice, wonderful popular presence he had as a kind of a good old boy Midwesterner. Actually, he was very sophisticated, but we knew him from his roles in the movie as a great character actor. I mean, he was on radio and television. He was really a kind of a folk icon, not in the sense of folk music, but in the broader sense of being a populist icon.
As we kind of fast forward a little bit to the May 9th date, that's kind of the Hollywood presentation, and Harold Arlen, Jimmy Van Heusen, who you mentioned, George Gershwin, who you talked about, Henry Mancini and Burt Bacharach. that is going to be quite a lineup that day. You're going to be doing some playing there, too. You must get exhausted from playing all the music of those great names, but tell us about May 9th and what we can expect and what some of your favorites are amongst that lineup.
Well, I should emphasize that really I do a lot of playing in all of these programs.
Mm-hmm.
There's lecturing, there's analysis, there's information, and then I always illustrate at the piano, and I play extensively actually in all of them. But the May 9th program covers so many composers because you had, as I said, you had the people who wrote kind of exclusively for Hollywood. Jimmy Van Heusen did his greatest writing, I think, for films, although he wrote Broadway shows too. And then you had Harry Warren, as I mentioned, who had been a Broadway composer during the 1920s and then was sent out to Hollywood. And he arrived there just at the right time in the early 30s. When the movie musical was just hitting its stride, and he just wrote hit song after hit song. And then Henry Mancini and more obviously much more recent composers, Henry Mancini and Burt Bacharach, who wrote so many film and television songs and themes, and that's a whole separate part of film writing, not just standard songs, but themes like Moon River and Alfie, songs that set the mood for the film. They're all exhausting, but they're all exhilarating too. And I get turned on by playing. Playing is so important to me, and that's you're conveying the music as it should be, and not just talking about it.
Well, looking back since 1978, when you first started playing and presenting at the Smithsonian events, what's been the most memorable program for you? Well,
I think the years when I was playing in the Baird Auditorium and I was playing for 550 people, and there were I won't tell you who they were, but there were two Supreme Court justices in the audience, and I knew they were there.
Wonderful.
And well, I seem to do well with the judiciary.
Playing it safe.
not the legislative branch. I don't know if they were there or not.
That's a great memory. Well, I know you love playing, and I wonder if you would consider playing something for us today. Maybe even something from Hoagy Carmichael. Maybe Stardust or Georgia.
I think I can manage that.
That'd be so nice of you, John Eaton.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me try them.
Good.
I'll play Hoagy Carmichael's Georgia, or a little bit of it anyway.
Thank you.
I could go on.
Oh, and I would love it. I would love it, John
I know
Eaton.
1,000 tunes.
Well, that music, Hoagy Carmichael, of course, what a great songwriter, winner of an Academy Award, George on My Mind, from Bloomington, Indiana, Hoagy Carmichael, played by John Eaton. Thanks so much for joining us today, John Eaton. Again, we're excited about your 4-session program at the Smithsonian, and my audience is just going to love this, as we've loved you for many, many years. But thank you so much, John Eaton, for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul. It was a great pleasure.
A pleasure for me, too. Thanks for playing, too. What a treat. My thanks to our guest today, John Eaton, who will be at the Smithsonian Associates program presenting a 4-part series starting April 18th and running to May 9th, 2018, titled John Eaton, From Broadway to Hollywood. My thanks as well to the Smithsonian team for all they do to support our interviews. As usual, we'll post links to everything, and also as usual, my thanks to you, the listeners, for joining me today. Your time is valuable. I'm grateful you're spending some of it with me, and I'm always interested in your feedback, so you can leave that at iTunes, Google Play, or send me email at info@notold-better.com. Stay tuned for our next show, another great one, as we talk about better, the Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. Oh, and one more thing. Check out Genealogy Bank at genealogybank.com/NOBS to support the show. Thank you.